Thank you, Val, and hopefully people can hear me. My wife has attested I'm in my 10th year of serving as stake president over in the Salt Lake Rose Park stake, and my wife tells me frequently that I don't whisper very well, and you can hear me from the stand. So hopefully that manifests itself today. I am delighted to be here. I'll just give a sort of a cautionary warning. I got my Bachelor of Arts degree in history in 1991 from the University of Utah, and then spent the next 18 years in accounting and finance. It's a very flexible degree, and when my staff would come in and look at my degree, they'd say history, and I just remind them that's all accounting is a history of numbers. And so, but I have always loved history. I wouldn't profess to be the resident expert on any one level of history. Don and I were just sharing some stories, and so frequently, along the way, there's a story underneath that. And I wished in my public service that people would understand history a little better. We have a horrible way of recreating history about every 20 years, and people just forget the consequence of certain decisions. Growing up, my father made nearly every family trip a church historical trip. And in 1975, he finally was able to finish the last leg of the pioneers coming into the Salt Lake Valley. And we were driving out in some pretty unusual areas, so he could see the wagon tracks and things as we came back through Wyoming. And just as we entered the valley around the 24th of July, he started getting sick, and a few weeks later was diagnosed with cancer, and died a few months after that. However, I'm always grateful for that heritage and for that understanding. I'm the tail end of the tail end of the tail end of all our families. And so my grandparents were born, my maternal grandfather was born in 1888, and my other grandparents were all born in the 1890s. And so my great-grandparents were actually pioneers that came across the plains in handcarts, and then so when I'd go to family reunions as a young teenager, all my counterparts were in their 70s, and they did you by generation, and I'm like, well, this is going to be thrilling. But I learned a lot, and I learned a lot of perspective from that, and I'm always grateful for that background. How did I get involved in the cemetery? I'm just going to go through a few, aside from my public service, and I will sort of a repentance thing. For 16 years, the condition of the Salt Lake City Cemetery was always a challenging conversation during budget season. The cemetery is subsidized nearly $1 million a year in operation costs just to maintain it. And it didn't seem like we ever got anywhere serious on the capital side in fixing the cemetery up. And as time has gone on, that has certainly manifested itself. I was always trying to get a study done so that we'd have a good comprehensive piece, and I'll talk about that. It didn't happen until after I left, but it has set the groundwork for what I hope will be a reformation of this important cultural heritage in our community. We'll just go through a few facts. This presentation is heavily geared toward the church, but I'll throw a little bit of life into it, and also the natural aspects of the cemetery. The windstorm of 2022, I think any of you probably remember that well. In my community of Rose Park over in the northwest part of Salt Lake, we were had a lot of heavy damage. About half my stake was without power for a week. And in fact, 4 of my neighbors all had we had an extension cords going to their homes to keep their fridges going from my generator, and including our house. And so I felt like a little power company there for about 5 days. But we lost a lot of large canopy trees, and the cemetery in particular received an immense amount of damage. Those trees, if you're used to them, some of them were near grave sites, and as the tree flipped over, it disrupted the grave sites, lifting headstones and causing other kinds of damage. One of the requirements of FEMA, it did meet the needs of a natural disaster, and one of the requirements that FEMA had is that in the restoration process that there be an archaeological process to assure that the integrity of the graves and the contents were accounted for. Not something that you would think, and this was during the pandemic, and so they closed the cemetery for almost a year. Until close to Memorial Day of maybe a half a year, I guess. And during that period of time, thanks to the church, who stepped forward both with financial and archaeological assistance, were able to assist the city in making the necessary assessments. And shortly before Memorial Day in 2021, the cemetery was reopened, but a lot of damage occurred during that process, and that's still being dealt with.
Pardon me, it said that the windstorm was September 2022.
Oh, it's 2020. You're right.
In your slide there.
Yeah, I got my dates wrong. It is 20. That's a fat finger on my part. Sorry. Thank you.
6 months or so.
Yeah, it was closed for 6 months, and even I snuck in one March and climbed the wall just to check on my parents' headstones and to make sure they were intact. But the cemetery was closed to the public. There were trees everywhere, and there were also concerns about holes that people could fall into because these roots were large and they left large craters in that process. So thank you for clarifying that for me. I got engaged in a weird way. My oldest brother, who inherited my dad's ability for church history, called and said he was concerned because as he was checking on some sites he has, he said Orrin Porter Rockwell's headstone had been toppled over. A tree had hit it and knocked it over, and wondered how that was going to get fixed. And so I made a call to the city council office, and they agreed to get back to me. They got back to me, gave me an update, and told me about the service that the church had offered and the work that was being done, and to a degree possible, headstones were getting fixed, and a lot of families stepped forward in some of those cases. And I left it at that. I reported out to my brother, and then 3 weeks later, a group of community members, only one of which is a member of the church, approached me and said, we're organizing a new 501c3 organization in order to improve the cemetery, and would I participate in it? And I thought about it because I really wasn't looking for one more community thing to get involved in. I already was serving on our mosquito abatement district board and a few others, but I felt like this was something important and something not only from our community perspective, but from the church's perspective, and I'll chat about that a little bit later. I don't think I need to give you any background to Orrin Porter Rockwell, other than to suffice it to say that he served Joseph Smith valiantly and was preserved as promised.
Wasn't he the oldest original member from April of 1830 when he died? Wasn't he the
boy?
I think he was an original from that first month or so. I think when he died in 1880, whatever, at the time he was the oldest living member of the church
from that early period. You're probably right. I'm not absolutely positive.
What a fascinating man.
There is in 1848, Mary B. Wallace, a very young child, passed away, and her father buried her up in the foothills above Salt Lake City. Brigham Young realized shortly thereafter that they needed a cemetery that was permanent, and so that they didn't get random burials to take place. Organized a committee which included Mary Wallace's father, and set aside originally 20 acres of land, as also coinciding with the incorporation of Salt Lake City as a city in 1851. And so the cemetery was established. Mary Wallace's father became the first sexton of the cemetery. And through the years, the cemetery has grown. This cemetery is 122 acres large. It's the largest municipal cemetery in the United States. And I'll show you a map here in a bit, because there's also some adjoining cemeteries that often look like they're part of the city cemetery, but they really are separate. The sexton's house was built shortly after the beginning of the 20th century, and it served as the sexton's house till 2002, in which it just became the offices for the cemetery, and is there. In the WPA period, the rock wall, which is famous if you go along 11th Avenue and elsewhere, there was built as part of the New Deal process, and that rock wall is also challenged with some structural challenges. Let's see.
How many millions of dollars of damage did they totally figure?
It's hard to put a value to a large tree. I haven't, because you can't replace those, at least not very fast. I would guess, and this is a pure speculation, I would guess that the damage was in the tens of millions of dollars when you think about it. But amazingly, there's still a lot of trees left there. In fact, I'll talk about this. The cemetery, the top part, just to orient you a little bit, is 11th Avenue. The sexton's house is in the bottom left-hand corner, and along with some maintenance facilities. But you have a Catholic cemetery to the east on the lower portion, and then you also have a couple Jewish cemeteries that are there, and as you go through those cemeteries, you can tell by the headstones and the names. Now, having said that, because Salt Lake City is really a gathering place, as you go through the cemetery, it entails a huge and significant history of our community, not only from the church side, but from the community at large. A number of governors are buried there, a number of other notable people, and I'll just mention a few of that. I think one of the reasons that church, amongst many, aside from being good members of the community, have an interest is that of the 16 past presidents of the church, 12 of them are buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And so Lorenzo Snow is buried in Brigham City, and President Benson is buried in his hometown up in Idaho. And then Brigham Young had his own private cemetery there between Main Street and State Street that the church maintains. And of course, Joseph Smith buried back in Nauvoo. This gives you, those dots are where each of those presidents are buried, and it just gives you a sense of that period. The one here, I think it's 5, let me make sure. Oh no, this one here, President Monson's burial plot. You might ask yourself, why is it in the old part of the cemetery? And what they did a few years ago is they had a couple roads that had become so dilapidated and frankly underutilized, they looked more like wagon tracks. And they took that land and they reclaimed it and created a brand new burial plot. So what you'll find in those sections is you'll have people that were buried there 100 years ago, and then all of a sudden, straight through the middle, you'll see a lot of new headstones and fairly recent burials, including President Monson's. I just go through and just show a couple things, and a lot of these are very noticeable as you drive through the area. John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff, Joseph F. Smith and his son Joseph Fielding Smith, Heber J. Grant, and while distantly related, George Albert Smith. Excuse me, he's not distantly related. I'm thinking of something else. And then David O. McKay and Harold B. Lee. It's pretty hard to miss President McKay's headstone as you go up the mountainside, along with President Hinckley's, which is just a short distance behind it. And then, of course, President Hunter is buried there. This is President.
Comment.
Please.
I knew the Hunter family very well, his two sons, and his headstone is the most modest.
Yeah.
All the presidents of the church. It really reflected his modesty, and just so modest. It is.
Well, my favorite connection, President Hunter was only president of the church for 17 months, and I was in my late 20s serving as a bishop in our ward there in Rose Park. And if you've ever served in that capacity, when you got a memo from church headquarters, the bishops were always the last one listed. And I'm like, yeah, because they make us do all the work. And so rhetorically, my counselor pointed out to me that Howard W. Hunter was the only president of the church to ever serve as a bishop. And so I felt a little bit validated that he understood what I was going through. It really wasn't that bad. I was just a whiner. You'll also find the headstone for Jedediah Morgan Grant, who was the first mayor of Salt Lake City. Morgan county is named after him, and son of and his son was Heber J. Grant, the seventh president of the church. John Milton Bernheisel, who was a delegate to the U.S. territory, our first delegate to the Utah territory, to the Utah House of Representatives, is buried there. And then William Henry Hooper, who was a delegate to the Congress as Utah was going through the debates of statehood.
Hooper, Utah must be named after him.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one.
Never thought of it.
Yeah. And then I think one of our most famous and distinguished, Martha Hughes Cannon, was the first woman state senator in the U.S. and her statue is scheduled to be in the Capitol. I think to make it done.
Linda and I were just there last week at the Capitol. Farnsworth is still there, the inventor of Philo, yeah, and it's still scheduled. They're doing all the logistics, so still about 2 or 3 months away. But she will then be in the Capitol. It'll be a big deal.
Yeah. And I've actually marked, for those of you who will go on the tour, I've actually marked her headstone, but what there's a larger Cannon sort of monument there, but hers is a pretty modest headstone when you think of her accomplishments. This just gives you a sense of other elected officials that are there, past governors, Olene Walker, our first female governor, and then some other senators, many of whom you'll recognize names, and some who are more historic. I just point out a couple community leaders, and as I was driving through the cemetery this morning, putting some markers in place, I just passed tombstone after tombstone, and every one of them has a history of our community or some connection or something that they've done. So as I throw these in here, it's just like scraping the top of the peanut butter. There's a lot more down underneath to get to. Richard Snellgrove, our representative of our love historically for ice cream. Larry H. Miller, who's buried not too far below 11th Avenue. James C. Fletcher, former president of the University of Utah, administrator for NASA, is buried over kind of on the west side, not too far from Lindsay Gardens. And then Joseph Standing, if you'll remember, Joseph Standing was a missionary in Georgia and murdered while he was serving by a mob. And as I was reading a little more to remind myself of that, eventually the mob shot him 13 times because they didn't want any one member of the mob to be attributed to his murder. And his body was brought back to Salt Lake, and
his companion later became apostle.
Yeah, Matthias Galley, companion, and the one that brought him back. Just a couple other, Emily Sophia Tanner Richards led the suffrage movement here in Utah and was instrumental in women having the right to vote. And then Jane Elizabeth Manning James, who, as you read the stories of Joseph Smith, was a frequent companion there, and in particular with Emma in those last days. And a beautiful movie was done a few years ago, and she's buried there. Lester Farnsworth Wire. Anybody know who Lester Farnsworth Wire is? Lester Farnsworth Wire, who was a policeman and responsible for controlling the traffic at 2nd South and Main, created the first red and green traffic light so that he didn't have to stand out in the middle of the street, and he just flipped the switch to whether it was red or green and to go. And from that evolved the traffic light. And I think it's almost a little bit ironic that the first electric traffic light was invented by somebody with the last name Wire. And then these 122 acres are a haven for wildlife, and you get a large variety of the surrounding community. If you live near the cemetery, it's really, in many ways, it's a 122-acre park, and you frequently see people walking through. It has a serene and beautiful surroundings. It also, because of the sheer number of trees, it achieved actual national arboretum status in 2021. There were 50 different species are required, but there are 75 different species of trees planted in the cemetery. And Mark Smith, who was the longest serving sexton, they named the arboretum in his honor. And you can actually go on a tour of the different types of trees. And there's a map here that shows you where you'll find each of those varieties through the cemetery. It's really a pretty place to be. That leads a little bit to the master plan. If you drive through the cemetery, let me ask this question: how many of you have a relative buried in the Salt Lake City Cemetery? Okay. I think, especially if you've been in Utah for a while, it's pretty hard not to have had somebody buried there. And in fact, there aren't a lot of double plots left actually in the cemetery. And my wife and I was sitting in a meeting, and my wife and I have been thinking about it. And all during my city council years, I was going to always go up. And one year we were discussing raising the fees, and I thought I need to go up and buy it before we raise the fees on everybody else. But I had a growing family, and it was one of those things, like in the scope of priorities. I thought, well, I can't afford it. Anyway, a year or so ago, I was sitting in a meeting, and they made the comment that I don't know if we have any double plots left. And and I got a panic, and I went and a couple times during our tenure, I'd asked if there were any available plots in the section where my parents are buried. And they had always told me, no, that section sold out a long time ago. Anyway, this time when I went in, the office staff said, oh, I don't know if these are real plots, but let me go look. And they went back in the files and they looked, and they said, I don't know if these are real or not, but there's 2 plots here next to the road. We'll send you up with staff and they can confirm whether somebody's buried there. And we went up, and it was right off the road. And we've told our kids that when Memorial Day comes, they can just throw the mums out the window and drive on by. But I am grateful, actually, to be able to be buried there. It's an important piece for me. But with diminishing, but if you've been there, the roads are challenged. They're pretty broken up. The irrigation system was old, and the walls are starting that were built during the WPA are starting to crumble in sections, and so a plan was put together that's nearly $40 million large. So this last year and a half, as friends of the city cemetery, we worked through the city council, and this last year they have committed an $11 million bond to go toward the cemetery. And then it took us 2 legislative sessions and working with some leadership, mostly in the Senate side. But the state just recently appropriated $3 million to add to that. And then the church has graciously offered a 7-figure gift to the city to do the detailed engineering needed for the stormwater, water, and road repairs. And my guess is there will be future opportunities, and as a 501c3, we'll be pursuing some philanthropic participation with that to try to do it. It'll be difficult to see in these pictures, but they're just cross sections of some of the roads and ruts that have developed over time, particularly the stuff going through the trees. You can't see those figures, but that rock wall gives you a sense of what's taken place there. And just for example, doing the wall repair itself is about $1.5 million. And so, these are some big ticket items, which is, one reason it's never been taken on. And the road repair costs, this figure is old. Anybody who's been in construction lately, these figures are about 4 years old, and that's $12 million, which probably by today's standard is closer to 20, is my guess. But anyway, as a 501c C3, I forgot the 3 number there, but we're not only are we participating in philanthropic, but to help the cemetery clean up and save some of their labor, we've organized community groups to go clean up after Memorial Day. We don't often think about that. We all put our mums and other plants out there, and most of those end up in the garbage. And so we take volunteers, we separate the pots from the plant materials, and the plant materials get composted, and the pot materials are recycled. And I should have got the figure, but it was like about almost 10 tons of materials that we pulled off all the headstones of stuff that got left there. I do curse the little steel clamps that people put down over their mums into the grass. Those things are a pain. But from that group, we have raised a number of volunteers, not only in the community, but a number of church groups have come to help us. And it's been a real eye-opening experience. If you're interested, on the, I think it's, I hope I have my dates right, June 8th, 9th, and then 11th. It's a Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday, yeah. Maybe you can confirm that for me. But we have groups come up on the 2 evenings, on the Wednesday and Thursday evening, and then Saturday morning. And my young men in my stake, as part of their young men's camp, a couple of years ago, cleared about almost a third of the cemetery. And in that process, one of my young men came across an ancestor's grave. And for the rest of the camp, talked about that heritage. And so I think, you know, aside from providing civic duty, you can't but go through that cleanup without having a deep reverence and respect for those that are buried there. We have commenced a couple of tree planting efforts each year to replace trees. And so we're replacing many of the trees that came down, and my wife and I have done that recently. And then, of course, working through different appropriation bodies. I have, Sarah, would you hand these out to everybody that would like one? They're in that blue folder there. These are maps that will be on our tour today. And I've made them, I have a laminator, so I laminated them all for you. And so you can just keep them. And whether you join us today or you go up later with family, or you want to go back and look at the sites and kind of find where graves are. We could spend like a whole day there walking around trying to find sites. The ground's pretty uneven, and so I do worry about folks tripping or getting there. But what we'll do, we do have some golf carts lined up. You could use your car, and we'll have 5 distinct stops where we'll stop and just kind of talk about things. It'll last us about an hour, and I can come back and give some more detailed information, Val, after you've done your announcements. But I just wanted to orient you to that map. And then on the back side of that map, you'll just see where different individuals are buried and what sections they're in. And so we took a number of legislators on tours and over the period of time. So that's it. Hopefully I didn't kill anybody. But are there questions? Yeah.
I assume there's a master list of all individuals buried there. Is that online?
There is. They are. I'm trying to think if it. They're still trying to. You could go into the sexton's office and they can look up anybody they want. If you go to some of the services like Billion Graves or Find a Grave, they can give you some efforts to do that. The city is giving, because it's such a highly visited place, interestingly enough, even visitors from out of town come and walk through that cemetery. Don was just talking about how he doesn't go to a vacation, that he doesn't make his wife find a cemetery somewhere. Well, he is not by himself. We get visitors, members and non-members alike, who are just interested to walk through that cemetery. So the city is actually working on an app that would make it easier to find with your phone, with geocoded positions to actually find the headstones. But that's a long answer to, you can go to the sexton's office, but some of these other Find a Grave and Billion Graves, do give some proximity locations.
Is there a gated locked at certain times of the day?
It is technically locked after 11 o'clock at night. I'm not, and it might even be sunset. I don't know that I've seen it truly locked very much. But this is similar to parks. If you're in there and the police don't think you should be in there, it's justification for them to ask you to leave. And so that, I wouldn't say it's a truly controlled area. And there's nobody there at night.
How many do you think are buried there?
There are 25,000 graves sites there. Yeah.
Total or filled or unfilled?
Total filled. Yeah, there's about 5,000 sites that are left to be filled, but not a lot to be bought. Most of the available sites, there's only maybe a 1,000 or so left.
So you still can buy a site. there.
Yeah, you may not be able to get a double site, which was the slight miracle for
What
us.
prices are there?
For the two sites we paid about $2,900. So they're not cheap, but they do let you have upright headstones, which most new cemeteries will not. Other questions? All right, thank you. You'll see, I could go for a pretty long list of folks that are buried in this area, but when you think about the size of, you just have to think in the context of the size of Salt Lake at the time. So all these names that we know in the history of our community really are buried next to each other. And you see that in the cemetery, and they tend to go in sections, and so walking through a cemetery, which is probably why remind me your name, Linda is subjected to going to cemeteries every place you visit. You do. You find out the character and the nature and who made up that community. I remember walking through the old Park City Cemetery, and it was actually pretty sobering to see sections with people all having the same death date. And you realize because a mine blew up and they lost all those deaths. So anyway, if you in this surrounding area, I'll just quickly run through a few names. You can see those. Emily Richards. I was trying to find her tombstone over here, but I couldn't find it. That I pointed out led the women's suffrage, and John A. Whitsoe, who was also an apostle, the president of the Utah State, Martha Hughes Cannon. And if you really want a good tour of this city cemetery, you'd want to go on a tour with a guy named Kent Cannon, who gives great stories and all the scandalous side stories that go with everybody. He's a lot more interesting than me, so I apologize. And unlike me, who has a political acumen of holding back those stories, Kent doesn't, so they're fun. But when you think of, if my memory serves me right, and Donna or whoever can correct me, but Martha Hughes ran against her husband and beat him. And so, that's one way to find out which of your neighbors like you. When I ran for office in my last two elections, I've served longer than anybody in Salt Lake City history for about 125 years. And in my last two elections, the third election was kind of competitive. And then people figured out who she was, and I got 2/3 of the vote. The next election, this lady didn't want me to run unopposed, so she ran again and still got 1/3 of the vote. What that told me is one out of every three of my neighbors hates me. they could care less who gets elected, but
2/3 of them like.
So yeah, I cherish the 2/3 and work on the other third. But anyway, Martha Hughes clearly was well liked by.
Where is hers?
Orange.
Orange,
perfect.
perfect.
There.
Okay, good.
Very inconspicuous. Kent will talk about how ugly the rest of the Cannon block is. That it's kind of their family heirloom or their acknowledgement. But anyway, it's a pretty modest setting. She's next to her husband there. Figure out, but this is Gordon B. Hinckley's headstone, and you'll probably remember from his passing when they were doing the conference center. Sorry, something popped in my ear. anyway, when they were doing the conference center, the church went through a process to get permission to quarry from the same quarry that they did the stone for the Salt Lake Temple. It had been closed for quite a while, and it required a series of special permits because they wanted the stone to be the same stone as the Salt Lake Temple. But that granite has a lot of impurities to it, or imperfections to it is probably a better way to describe it. And so, you know, when you look at the headstone, and if you look at the conference center or the temple, it's not the pure and clean granite that they get in Europe and in Italy and other places that you see in a lot of other buildings. But it certainly has a lot of heritage. And as they were pulling that out, there was some excess stone, and President Hinckley asked the stone company that they would do his headstone with it. So
It's hard to see.
it was very apropos, and he was very instrumental in the creation of the conference center. The larger statue down at the bottom is David O. McKay's next to the other orange stick there, and that's pretty noticeable. You don't very often miss that headstone. Of course, he was a man tall and just in stature, and I think those that knew and his longevity and his involvement in the community. And then Henry Moyle's tombstone is just to the left of Chad, and certainly known well in the legal community and then in certain things. Around this area, would just note a couple others that are buried near here. Sherm Lloyd, for those of you who remember, Sherm Lloyd was a longtime member of Congress, and my little story there is my brother was on a Senate campaign, and as a young 11-year-old kid, I was working the floor at the Republican convention, and some unknown guy named Warren Hatch was running, and we thought we were shoo-in, and apparently not. Warren Hatch won, and Ronald Reagan was there, and so that was kind of fun. Wallace Bennett's buried in the area, as well as Spencer Kimball, and then Arthur Shepard, a conductor and composer. On the left of this pine tree, if you look straight through there, just before this pine tree, you'll see a blue stake, and that's Heber Wells, who was the first governor of the state of Utah after it took statehood, and a number of his family, again, are buried in that area. Just a couple other, there's a lot of notables here. I'll just kind of go through the list real quick. Joseph Lafayette Rollins is buried in the area. John Thomas Keynes, senator and delegate to the in the Utah Territory. Phoebe Beatty, a suffragist. Edward Partridge Kimball, Mormon Tabernacle Choir organist. Albert Thomas, also a U.S. Senator from Utah. Ellis Reynolds Schitz, the second female doctor of Utah, and well known from the medical community history. And then my understanding is, and I was just looking for it earlier, but I think President Monson's headstone is actually kind of over in this area. Again, you can kind of see as you look down through the middle of this section, you'll see a lot of fairly new headstones.